ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webcast entitled Rio and Zika, Managing Communication Challenges. Today's conversation is brought to you by Cision and commpro.biz and powered by Onstream Media. To submit a question or comment at any time during the webinar, please click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the Submit button. Alternatively, you can submit your question via Twitter using the hashtag CisionWebinar. All questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to today's host, James Rubec, Cision's Canada's content strategist. He directs original research for the brand using its social intelligence and media monitoring tools. James, the floor is now yours.
Thanks so much. Today, I'm so lucky to be joined by Peter Land, a partner at Finsbury, who has worked for some amazing brands. He was AOL's global head of corporate communications. He worked for Pepsi-Cola and Kraft Foods, and he was just actually in Rio working on part of Finsbury for a couple clients you might know pretty well, Citibank and Toyota. So today we're going to talk about Rio and Zika and other communication challenges that the games this year actually faced. And we did some original research actually monitoring topics and issues around the games and the games themselves to try to find out what was resonating with the public, both in North America, both Canada and the United States, and in Brazil itself. And initially, when you're thinking about the Olympics, you think about daunting physical feats and outstanding performances. But if you listened to the conversation before the games, you might have really only heard about mosquitoes. Of course, Zika is a serious health issue. People were contracting this virus and, endangering potentially their children's lives, their unborn children. But really, once the games got going, it might have just been an issue with Lockheed. If you didn't actually watch any of the games themselves, you almost would only think that, one incident, one issue was actually the whole news conversation about the games. But really, was it? So when we do an analysis, we start looking at it. We start kind of picking it apart. And while before the games, what you could see is, Zika is obviously a really big deal. Once the games got going, and this slide looks at August 10th to August 24th, you see crime and violence, stories about crime, were 40% of the conversation. This is excluding the actual games themselves, the actual competition. Another 19% is security. So, are the games secure? And then, of course, terrorism and boycotts and some of the other major issues that are facing Brazil. But when we go, further and further back, really you can see this is 6 months back, going from August 24th. Zika really was the main section of the story. It wasn't necessarily crime. It wasn't cyber threats, possible cyber terrorism caused by hackers from anywhere in the world, or human rights abuses or issues that were going on in Brazil. Really, it was the silly mosquitoes that are causing some serious harm for some amount of people, but not really as much of an issue as you might think. Zika overall in the news, athletes were saying they were going to drop out of the games. We had golfers like Vijay Singh just avoid the games completely. Canadian tennis star Milos Raonic skipped the games himself, as well as another tennis star Rory McIlroy. But really, how big of a deal was Zika when it came down to it? When the games actually got started, what we were seeing is Zika really wasn't that big of a deal. People were more concerned about the health quality of the water in Brazil. They were worried about was the water going to affect athletes. People were talking a great deal about just general health of the athletes and the athletes' village, but Zika really wasn't that big of a deal when it came to the news. Excluding Zika, there were over 100,000 news conversations and social media mentions about health during the Olympics. And Zika itself, really, almost 80,000 conversations. That's a lot of people talking about it, but in the grand scale of it, over an entire month of conversations, it's not that big of a deal. And then we go back to Ryan Lochte, whose incident you might have heard of. So this is before Ryan Lochte's incident. So if you didn't actually read the news, it's possible you didn't. Ryan Lochte and a group of swimmers went out one night in Brazil, and that evening they went to a gas station. They were trying to use the washroom, and they weren't allowed to. And there was some argument between Ryan Lochte and these swimmers and the owner of this gas station. Soon thereafter, police were called, and this is where things get fuzzy. The police say that Lochte was arguing with them and he damaged some property at the gas station. And Lochte at the time said that he was held up at gunpoint. People were trying to rob him and his swimmer colleagues. It turned out not to be the case for him, and he fled the country, or left, strategically. So this is before. There was really no correlation between Ryan Lochte and crime in Brazil. There was lots of conversations about crime in Brazil, up to 45,000 social media mentions and news mentions a day. But just after that, in the week directly after this gas station incident, this is what we get. So, excluding crime, there was a fairly substantial portion of the conversation was still there. But when you include Lochte, you start seeing these huge spikes. So on the 14th, this is when, kind of at the beginning of this chart, on the 14th, news comes out that Ryan Lochte has been involved in an armed robbery. Now, 4 days later, and I guess it's the old saying, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Ryan Lochte has been found out to have allegedly lied to police and left the country in some haste. So what you can see here is this is not a debate between causation and just correlation. There is distinct correlation and causation here. When you look at the actual share of voice, so really bringing it down to the percentages, the Lochte incident accounted for 42% of all conversations about crime between August 14th and August 24th. So we're just going to quickly go back up to our issues slide. This is obviously a huge issue. If 40% of crime is the conversation of any of the issues during the Olympics, and one guy's incident and the cover-up around it is 42% of all conversations about crime, Ryan Lochte's incident accounted for 16% of the share of voice of all incidents during the Olympics. One guy's incident created 16% share of voice of all of the problems during the Olympics. We can get this data by building out essentially search equations. It's never one hot hashtag, so in this case it could be Lochtegate, but we searched hundreds of terms, and this is just a small subsection of how we pull in this data. But I'm going to turn it over to Peter, and we're going to start a discussion about what these sort of issues mean for brands, and really what are the result of sponsorships, and what are the results of issues, and how can brands navigate these issues. So we're just going to start out, Peter, maybe before we jump into understanding how this is so damaging to a personal brand, do you want to share a little bit of insight about what you were doing in Rio and a little bit about your experience?
Sure, I'm happy to do it. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And just safe to say, I wasn't doing anything that the U.S. swim team was doing. Before I get into kind of what we were doing down there, I think the macro point that you were speaking to, and all the different research that you did, the most important thing to know about the Olympics and really big event programming in general is that until the competition actually begins, the news cycle has this enormous amount of oxygen that needs to be, filled, if you will, with copy, right? And so whether it's Zika or, security or the facilities or the government in Brazil, there are journalists who've been assigned to write about various parts of the Olympic movement, the business side, the political side, the security and safety side. And before the actual games begin, it's very hard to get the actual true story of what's happening unless you're physically on the ground in the market. And most of the journalists covering the Olympics don't actually arrive into Brazil until, 2 or 3 days before the games. So much of the coverage is kind of a little bit of word of mouth, a lot of phone interviews, third parties who might or might not, kind of have specific and exact information. So it's not surprising that this Olympics, like Olympics before it, had a lot of negative coverage before the games begin, because that is the kind of typical pattern of whether it's Sochi in 2014 and especially Beijing in 2008. There again is this enormous news cycle, and obviously now with the advent of social and so many different digital platforms. So again, you need the beast needs to get fed on an ongoing basis with media coverage. And then magically the opening ceremonies happens, and it kind of immediately changes the conversation, because then you get to actually start talking about the games themselves, and it obviously starts with the pageantry of the opening ceremonies, and then you go into the competition. And once the competition starts, it's like this cloud tends to get lifted from the games, and the vast majority of media coverage is focused on the actual competition and the reason the Olympics takes place, which is all about the positive elements of competition. So I think that's the kind of the basic, when you look at the Olympics and other kind of big event program, although Olympics is probably a unique case because it happens infrequently and it happens in different cities around the world. That tends to be kind of how the news cycle works. So I thought that was just an important kind of way to set the landscape, and then we can kind of go to your specific questions. And I know the first one was about you were going to ask about kind of what happened with Ryan and kind of how damaging it is for a personal, for an athlete, or any kind of celebrity, when something like what happened to him happened. And obviously it's a big deal, right? And I think that you look at it from two perspectives. There is Ryan Lochte, the individual, and then there are the brands that are associated with him in that moment, right? And so the most important area for him is just his reputation, right? It's like it's like we all know in the communications business, you make one mistake and it kind of stays with you forever, right? It's really hard to shed that moniker, whatever that might, whatever the effect might have been of your actions. Whether you can apologize, and there's lots of things you can do, but it's pretty hard once the media has kind of captured you in a moment to kind of undo that. So the impact for him on a long-term basis is reputational. Now there are absolutely ways that he can overcome that over time. I think it's going to take a little bit of time because the current narrative around him is obviously a negative one, and he's going to have to live with the consequences of that. But I do think over time, depending on his behavior and how you come out of a crisis and behave after the crisis is always more important than when you're kind of in that moment. The second impact is obviously financial. The sponsors, the people that were associated with Ryan, kind of ended that relationship. I know Ralph Lauren did and Speedo did, and I think that's an important but pretty obvious point to make to the group here today, which is when a company decides to sponsor an athlete, they're essentially marrying their brand with the athlete's brand. They've made the decision, we have a brand, whether it's Speedo or Polo, and our brand's pretty good. Like, we don't need Ryan Lochte. Our brand does really well without this athlete. We are going to sell a lot of bathing suits, a lot of goggles. Ralph Lauren's going to sell a lot of stuff with or without Ryan Lochte. But before the games, they made the decision that this marriage of these two brands will help us and will help him. So that's the decision we've made as a brand. And hopefully, they had morals clause, they had all kinds of protections and so forth in their contract, but there's a positive intent at the beginning. So as soon as an athlete or an entertainer or somebody does something to their personal brand, the sponsor says, wait a minute, that marriage is no longer what I thought it was going to be. The relationship I now have actually hurts my brand. So I'm going to end that relationship. So obviously there was a financial impact to him, and I think it was the right decision by these companies to say, this brand association doesn't help me anymore, and that's why I got into it in the first place. And the last three impacts were really more around the games themselves, right? Some of the data that Cision shared, the amount of media coverage that transitioned from the performance of the athletes, the inspirational moments of the athletes, some of the positive things that were happening in Brazil, that oxygen that we talked about before the game shifted back to, what really happened, the apology, behavior, boorish behavior by athletes and things of that nature. So unfortunately for the games themselves, it painted a negative picture of the police in Rio originally because of what he said. So it was really disappointing because it took a lot of the spotlight away from the thousands of athletes who were there doing incredibly positive things. And then the governing body, USA Swimming, had to navigate it with him, and the USOC had to navigate, the problem. So really one thing, which in the moment might have seemed minor, escalated into something enormous, and I'm sure he obviously regrets what happened, but especially in today's media environment, one mistake can get just magnified by such an enormous, with such an enormous lens. It really did have, kind of multiple impacts. So it was definitely an unfortunate incident.
Kind of building off of that, there are, brands will sponsor the games themselves. Coca-Cola did, McDonald's did. Obviously, TD Ameritrade and GE, they all played parts in the sponsorships. And just like when something really negative happens, such as, from Speedo's or Ralph Lauren's perspective, the Lockheed incident, for McDonald's, they had a huge boost. Like, so this was an article from The Guardian, this one was from the Washington Post, and it was identifying that athletes in the Olympic Village, they were eating a ton of McDonald's because McDonald's was free. It was food that they trusted, and it was food that was pretty readily available across the athletes' village. There was multiple locations where people could get food. In a phenomenon like this, Peter, could you explain to me how brands are capitalizing on when something like this goes viral or when a positive sponsorship really has a high benefit?
Sure. First of all, McDonald's still does have the best fries. So at the end of the day, that's kind of we all know that to be true. But look, I think that the beauty of what happened down there was that it was not planned, right? I don't think that anybody sat in a conference room with McDonald's or any of their agencies and said, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have McDonald's, restaurants nearby. The athletes are going to, find their way to McDonald's. They're going to like the fact that it's free, and then they're going to talk about it. And then, they're going to, we're going to get some media coverage on it. So sometimes the best laid plans from a strategic and creative standpoint can be magnificent on many levels, but they can't replace kind of something that's serendipity because that actually feels genuinely authentic, right? So I think one of the reasons the McDonald's example worked so well for them was it was 100% believable, and it truly was authentic to who they are. And a lot of it were American athletes, dining on the food that they were comfortable with. And I think for brands it's a hard question, right? Because what you're asking is, how do you capitalize on something that you don't know is actually going to happen, right? How do you anticipate or plan for it? And I think the best brands in that case, what they do is they kind of quickly mobilize, right? So we've all seen the story about Oreos in the Super Bowl, and so I think part of it is having a team in place to capitalize on something as soon as they see it happening, right? So I think there's the immediacy and being prepared. Even if you have no idea something's going to happen, you have to kind of have a team in place and the technology in place and the ecosystem in place to quickly move when something positive happens. So that's number one. Number two is, I think you have to look at these now more than ever, this concept of a multi-platform approach. You wouldn't take what happened with McDonald's and write a press release, right? I mean, that would have been something, 15 years ago or even, 8 years ago. But the idea of quickly getting visuals out into the market, video, real voices, nothing beats the authenticity and the visual representation of what's happening to help paint and tell your story. So we tell all of our clients here, that it's really important that we create video ahead of time. We create as many visuals as we can. We might only end up using 10% of them, but you have to have an arsenal of video and visual components at your disposal on the off chance that something breaks your way. You have to take it and run with it. And lastly, in this area, I think, staying true to the brand is important. People will realize it if they're being PR'd, right? And that can backfire. But to have a little bit of fun. Look, it's the Olympics. It's sports, right? So there are some serious, issues that pop up during the Olympics. But at the end of the day, people mostly get inspired to watch the Olympics because of the competition, the athletes, the joy, the inspiration, the courage, the overcoming obstacles. So I think for all the sponsors that are associated with the games, if they can stay true to who they are, but also acknowledge that they're partnering with something, that is for the most part inspirational and fun, that will end up providing the most value back, for the sponsors.
I think it's really interesting how you're outlining these steps for capitalizing on good news, because when I'm looking at some of these crises and how brands responded, I feel like it's almost an inverted look at exactly what they do, just from a positive angle. So, kind of leading into that, like how can brands prepare in advance of these major events to, one, mitigate possible crises that come their way, opposed to kind of the really positive news stories, as we've been discussing a little bit. What's some advice you have for preparing for major events?
Sure. So, look, I mean, I think, our clients, and I know for sure that, every major sponsor, especially the ones who weren't, headquartered in Brazil, but if you were a multinational company going to the Olympics, you were going to be there for 3 weeks with senior executives and potentially thousands of staff on the ground, you absolutely had a crisis and issues communications plan. It's not even, it's not optional, right? So every sponsor has a plan that's a combination of communications will often lead the development of the issues management plan, but every part of the company typically gets involved. So it's a business continuity group, the employee, the HR division, general counsel, investor relations, depending on the company. So what's really important is that all parts of the company have a chance to weigh in, to the issues and crisis plan ahead of time, because if anything does happen, it does have multiple impacts. Even, Lockheed's a pretty good example, right? So, whether it was Lauren or Speedo, I'm sure they all had something in their plan that said, if one of our athletes does something, that we think is not, positive behavior, we can quickly move to rectify it. So I'm relatively certain that they didn't start from the beginning when that happened, that they all had the plan ahead of time. So, again, part of the strategy ahead of time is making sure all the key senior executives have seen, your crisis plan and have understand their role in it. Establishing the facts is obviously, going to be, very, very critical. I think that's, again, part of the problem in the swimming situation was the facts were a little bit unclear. But really getting to the bottom of exactly what happened, when it happened, why it happened, and who can corroborate, whatever the story was, is important. We work with a lot of different clients in issues in crisis, and making sure you're as honest and open and do it as quickly as you can, is always kind of a key factor in kind of crisis communications 101, if you will. You need to get out ahead of the story before it can control you. And look, again, his situation was somewhat unusual in that, it initially broke because a reporter was talking to his mom on a bus, right? So honestly, you can't prepare for that. You can have the best crisis manual in the world, and I guarantee it didn't have, when the athlete's parent talks to a journalist from another country on the bus, this is what we're going to do. So your plan needs to be nimble enough to shift over and move if it goes in another direction. You need to move with it. I think certainly we did with our clients, and I imagine most of the others did as well. You practice before you go down. Let's assume this happens. Let's play it out. Okay, who's going to be on site? Who's back at the hotel? Who's back at corporate headquarters? If it's this time of day, how do we want to move on this? What's the chain of command on who gets notified when? So you do practice ahead of time so that you feel like you're confident when you're going into it. If something happens, you can move pretty quickly. Again, kind of going down the list here on the slide. All very straightforward and fairly basic things in crisis communications, but clear roles and responsibilities. Somebody has to lead, and other people have to follow. And that's okay. Somebody's going to be monitoring media, and somebody else is going to be notifying the CEO. So being very, very clear ahead of time so that everybody is working off the same plan and knows exactly what their specific role is super important. We have there the marketing off switch. Depending on what the crisis is, does it feel tasteless if, there's an issue with a brand and then you start seeing 30-second spots on NBC and you need to be in a position, to tell the network, you need to stop running our ads. That didn't happen, but you need to be prepared, to do that. And the last 2 points are, the Olympics is a global event, so you need to have global sensibility. And I think a lot of companies, frankly, here in the U.S. for the most part, we forget sometimes that time zones matter and languages matter. So you can issue an apology, but if you're doing it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that might be great, but it's 3 o'clock in Tokyo. And Tokyo is hosting the next Summer Games. So what are the implications of putting out a statement at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in New York time, when other parts of the world, it's just not the right time. So I think you need to think beyond your boundaries and really understand, it's a pretty big world out there, especially with the Olympics, and to try to make sure that you're really thinking globally. Even though the activity might have happened locally, it's pivotal that you have a global sensibility. And last is this multi-stakeholder consideration. Again, as we talked before on the Lochte situation, think of all the different people that were involved. The USOC, the IOC, USA Swimming, coaches, other athletes, his sponsors. So every action there's going to be a reaction, right? So you have to really think through all the different components and all the different groups who are impacted. We've been involved with a lot of different crisis situations with sponsors of events. And frankly, sometimes the best advice is calling the other sponsors and saying, hey, before we go out and say something, where are you guys on this issue? It might be a different agency, it's okay. You kind of break down those barriers and say, look, I don't really care that we might be competing in the marketplace, but on this particular thing, we should be together and aligned. So, whether it was the FIFA crisis or some other areas where multiple sponsors kind of got together and said, look, we collectively have this point of view. And that can be really powerful because if you're trying to make a very strong statement, 4 or 5 companies all saying the same thing is a lot better than one. So frequently we will kind of reach out and find friendly partners to join us in a position we might have on a particular issue.
You worked for Pepsi-Cola.
I did.
And when you were working there, could you describe a little bit about the process about how you might choose an individual celebrity, whether it's an athlete? How would you go about selecting them as a sponsor opportunity for the brand?
Sure, that's a great question. So it kind of gets back a little bit to what we talked about before. It has to feel like it's a natural fit for the brand. Now, luckily, for PepsiCo, we had a lot of great brands that people wanted to be associated. So Gatorade's the most obvious example, right? If you are an athlete who sweats, okay, you want a Gatorade deal, okay? It confers like you've kind of made it, right? So we had the luxury of actually selecting athletes that we thought, could make an impact. So Serena Williams is a great example of that, right? So Serena Williams, doesn't necessarily need Gatorade's money, and Gatorade doesn't necessarily need Serena Williams. They have, hundreds of athletes. Yet, we believe that she truly embodied, what the Gatorade spirit was about, of toughness and authenticity and trying your hardest and giving it your all. So we tried to find athletes that would really, because we essentially had our choice of anybody, right?
Yeah.
But we had to pick the athletes that when fans were watching a tennis match and on a changeover could see sweat pouring off of Serena Williams and she's drinking Gatorade, it's very, very believable. It's very authentic in the moment. Nobody's thinking she's only drinking that Gatorade because she's getting paid to drink the Gatorade. The consumer research showed that people, it works. This is a product that works. She's in the middle of intense competition, and that's when people need this product. So for Gatorade, it was really, finding that authentic, or athlete or property where we could kind of, we used to talk about the point of sweat, instead of point of sale, where you could really make an impact on people, in a very, very believable way. With Pepsi, with brand Pepsi, it's slightly different because that brand was more about fun and music, and we wanted that brand to be where people were having a great time. It could be concerts, it could be sporting events, it could be, festivals, music festivals. So Pepsi was there was a desire to match the personalities with the personality of the brand. So it was less about, very specific authenticity and more about, would people believe that this is an athlete or a celebrity or entertainer that is enjoying themselves, enjoying the moment, and having a great time while they're doing it. So it varies. Each brand's going to have a little bit of a different profile. Quaker and Tropicana are brands that want to appeal to more of a mom, kind of an audience. So the associations with those two brands might have been a little bit more family-oriented or wholesome, if you will. So I kind of varied on a brand-by-brand basis, but it was always, how do you make sure it feels authentic to the brand, doesn't feel forced. And also from a PR standpoint and communication standpoint, we wanted to make sure that, was this a believable, if you were going out into the marketplace, is it a credible relationship that people would find, meaningful kind of in the marketplace.
So I just wanted to open up to, if anyone has any questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A tab. Just kind of here in the browser, we'll field any questions you have for either Peter or I. Building off of kind of that fun that you were discussing involving Pepsi, what are some of the brand benefits for brand sponsoring the games? What do they expect to see out of it, and why do they choose sponsoring such a large global event? It's not necessarily going to target a specific niche, but why do they choose this event as a choice for their sponsorship dollars?
Sure. So, look, I think if you talk to 10 Olympic sponsors, they might have 10 different reasons for why they sponsor the games, right? I saw a really interesting article yesterday. It was an article from a journalist that was kind of apologizing for some of the negative coverage of the games, and he wrote a line that I thought was really important. It said, people need to understand the Olympics and the IOC, they're not in the infrastructure business, they're in the inspiration business, right? Which I think is an important factor for the Olympics. For 17 days, at least here, and I can speak for most of the world because the data supports it, the entire world is watching. Most people don't experience the games on site in Rio. It's probably 0.2% of the people that experience the Olympics experienced it, on the ground. Most people experience it in their home, watching it on television, and then their kids start trying to imitate Simone Biles, in the living room. right? So the companies that sponsor the Olympics are trying to tap into the emotional lift and the emotional connection that most people in the world, frankly, have with the Olympics. Are there cynics? Absolutely. Are there problems with facilities after the Olympics are over and they don't often get used, and there are financial issues? And absolutely. But during those 17 days, all of that, most of that stuff, almost all of it goes away, and most people are genuinely inspired. The athletes, they're not highly paid, if paid at all, right? They're doing it for the love of their country. They've been practicing for 4 years to run 9 seconds on the track, okay? And most of the athletes in the 100 are not getting paid a lot of money to train for 4 years for 9 seconds, right? And I think most consumers, most fans really understand that, that they're not professional athletes, that are flying, that are on the charter, going between cities and making $10 million a year. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So I think the brands that are in the games kind of recognize and appreciate that, and they expect to get a brand lift out of that association, right? I mean, I'll tell you, Citi is a good example because they're a client of ours. They would tell you that for 200 years they've been supporting American businesses overseas. So the concept of supporting Americans doing something positive overseas and making an impact in the world, fits perfectly with what they say and they do every day, right? So to them, it was a very simple, a story and an almost obvious association. So there are brands that are looking for that brand lift, and it's not, by that association with the games. But I'll tell you, if you wait until the Olympic Games as a sponsor to achieve the benefit, you probably will have lost, because for the sponsors, the opportunity is usually 3 to 4 months before the games begin. Is when they're, again, as we talked before, the competition's not yet happening. So if you're a sponsor who wants to get your story out, the best time to do it is in the 100 days before the games begin, because once the games start, people care a little bit less about the sponsors and a lot more about the athletes.
I saw some really great examples of that, even people who weren't necessarily sponsoring. Ford Canada, for instance, for about a month, way before the Olympics started, they were sending out these 60-second Instagram videos. Mm-hmm. And on the Instagram videos themselves, they'd have people pretending to do the trampoline on the top of their car. And then people would be submitting their own kind of examples of kind of these silly 1-minute videos, but tying it back to the game. It's just that they did it all before. Of course, they weren't sponsors, so they couldn't necessarily use all the branding. But that's a great example of.
And I think getting out ahead of it's important. And I think a lot of sponsors are involved in the games for the employee piece of it, right? I mean, we worked on a long time ago on a program for Home Depot, and I would say when they got involved in the Olympics, the primary reason to do it was to get their employees inspired by the athletes. It was all about, how do we use the Olympic Games to get our employees to kind of see and feel like what it's like to be an Olympian and to kind of come to work every day and to, overcome obstacles and achieve. So for a lot of sponsors, this is kind of the one area that's probably not talked about, that much, but I can tell you that all the sponsors care about it deeply, is the employee piece of it. I mean, at PepsiCo, when we sponsored something, part of the reason to do it was a way to get our bottler network, hundreds and hundreds of bottlers around the world, engaged in a program and to get them unified around one thing, and sports and entertainment is usually the way to do that. So it has a deep kind of a connection to sponsorship, to the employee. The sponsors have a deep connection to getting their employees motivated, and as a way to engage the employees. At Citi, for example, we took our athletes to Citi headquarters throughout the United States in the 100-day period leading up to the games. And again, in the U.S., I think we get a little spoiled, that we have to win medals and we have to be atop the leaderboard in gold medals. but frankly, just an Olympian showing up at your office, at your headquarters, win, lose, or draw, the fact that an Olympian is in the building, it is hugely motivational. And even outside the United States, if you just qualify for the Olympic Games in most countries, that athlete is a hero. So if you can kind of take that athlete and bake them into an employee program that you're working on, there's huge benefits there. So that's the other reason. Another reason a sponsor might get involved with the games. And then there's the global nature of it that we've talked about before. It does give you an opportunity to do global marketing. But look, at the end of the day, for every sponsor that you see, for every top Olympic sponsor, the Olympics is not the only thing they do. Again, let's be candid about it. It is still 2 to 3 weeks every 2 years, right? So you can't put all of your eggs in the Olympics basket. That's too infrequent. So for most, pretty much almost every sponsor of the Olympics, it's one tool, kind of in their toolbox. It's an important tool, and it's a great tool, but it's just one of many things that they would be doing.
You were on the ground, and you got to see a lot of how these brands activated live on site. Could you share a couple examples of some of the kind of exciting or innovative communication tactics that these brands deployed?
Sure. On site, as we were saying before, it's actually they're somewhat less obvious, right? Yeah. Because again, a lot of what happens on site ends up being customer entertainment and employee hospitality because the focus is so much on the athletes themselves and on the competition. But at the Olympic Village, we talked about McDonald's. We talked about a little bit about Coca-Cola. Always has pretty significant activations on site. They typically embed music into their sponsorships. So they would have concerts, in and around the games to get more people involved. I think one of the interesting things that happens at every games where sponsors will get involved is the torch relay, right? So there was a local bank involved in the torch relay. I actually think there was I think it was Bradesco. So there was a bank. I'm trying to think of some of the other things that happened on site that were particularly interesting. I just don't want to talk about all of our clients. It'll make it seem like it's too obvious. But I think that who else did I see that was interesting? What you see on site a lot of is just really good branding, right? Again, because if you are like when you get into the airport in Rio, Bridgestone, for example, had really strong out-of-home, kind of throughout the airports. Omega also, I think, does a very good job. Not every sponsor is actually part of the broadcast, but Omega is because they're essential to the actual event for timekeeping purposes, right? So I thought they did a nice job because they not only had great on-site exposure, like in the airports. If you were flying into Rio from anywhere in the world, there's no way you would miss Omega. The way they branded the airport, it was, and they happen to have Michael Phelps, in advertising. So the combination of kind of picking the right guy and doing a very good job creatively, married to when you watch the broadcast, you would see them again. And not that many sponsors have that kind of 1-2 punch, right? I think Panasonic in a few places had it because when you watch the athletes come out and introduce that there's a Panasonic screen behind them, and Panasonic also had kind of other areas where that happened. Samsung had a pretty good, at Copacabana, they had a pretty strong presence there. But again, I think, you don't want to overinvest on the ground because the ROI is going to be challenging based on how many people you're actually going to touch on the ground versus the people you're going to touch in other ways. So you have to make sure not to overinvest in the on-the-ground piece.
Yeah, you could do marketing within a country or region where they're going to be watching, and it's more advantageous for your brand, but you don't only go after the 0.02% that are in Brazil. You want to go after the 100, 200, 300 million people that are watching at home for any specific event.
Or in the markets. So Citi, for example, Citi recreated an Olympic environment at Pier 26 in New York, right? So during the games, if you lived in Manhattan, you got to go down to Pier 26 and, do a virtual reality race against Allison Felix and, light a torch and eat Brazilian food and watch it on NBC. So thousands of people were able to experience the Olympics through city in New York, even though the games were in Brazil. So I think a lot of sponsors look to do that, and how do you make it personal in the country that you're, if you don't necessarily want to invest in the country where the games are being held, how do you invest in markets that matter to you?
I don't want to jump too far into specifics about this, but when you think about an investment to recreate an Olympic experience in Manhattan or in any city, really, it's obviously a fairly serious investment. What would the actual, can you give me a ballpark range of what a sponsorship of the Olympics are? Like, what do you think Coca-Cola or McDonald's would invest?
I absolutely cannot give that to you.
Okay, no problem.
There are too many people on the phone.
So, outside of questions about financials of what people would invest at the Olympics, we'll take almost any question, quite literally. But we'll just kind of jump into a conclusion. We'll kind of, as some of these questions come in.
Sure.
So, how should brands prepare, and what do they do in cases of crisis at large global events?
Let me back up and answer your financial question in a different way, right? If a company, what we do recommend is the following, right? And I think the communications people and marketing people on the phone will appreciate, hopefully, the sentiment behind this, which is, if you're going to spend $1 on the rights fees associated with the Olympics, or the NBA, or the U.S. Open. Pick your event. If the property has said to you, we're going to charge you $1 to be the official something of the Olympics, the U.S. Open, whatever it might be, we tell the chief marketing officers and the other people we do business with, you should allocate $3 for every $1 you spend on the rights fee. So if you're going to spend $1 on the rights fee, you need to set aside $3 for PR, social, event marketing, TV advertising, whatever it might be. The activation budget needs to be 3 times whatever it is you're paying the property. So I think, without answering the question directly, I think for the people on the phone, as you're talking to your people internally, if you're considering sponsorships, the biggest mistake sponsors make sometimes is they spend so much on the rights fee and they don't leave enough to actually take advantage of it. We'll leave you at least with that, without a dollar figure, but I think from a ratio perspective, we like to say 3 to 1.
I think that's really, really great insight, and that's kind of really hit the nail on the head for what I was really looking for, I think. We've got a couple of questions coming in now. What is a common mistake that brands do when partaking in such a large sponsorship? Okay.
I think one of the mistakes is I think we talked about it a little bit, but it's like not thinking about the employees first, right? So I've actually been involved in a couple of sponsorships very, very, very early on, like helping negotiate the deal. And there's an instinct, I think, for companies to want to announce the deal, right? Let's tell everybody that we just became a sponsor of X. And what we always tell people is the first group you should tell is your employees. Okay, so let's say you're company X and you have 20,000 employees. The most important group at the beginning of a large sponsorship, in my opinion, is the employees, because if you have 20,000 employees with an average of 700 Facebook friends, and their friends and so forth, if you can get early ambassadors inside the company that have nothing to do with the sponsorship. They might have had nothing to do with the deal getting signed, they weren't the lawyer, they weren't the chief general counsel, they weren't the CMO, they weren't the CEO. There might have only been 10 people at the company that knew the sponsorship was about to get signed, but there's 19,990 other people at the company that need to get inspired. especially with the Olympics. So I think one mistake that companies can make around such large things is putting the employees like second, third, or fourth on the list. In my opinion, they should go first or really close to the top of the heap. And then I think the second one we talked about a little bit too, which is not setting aside enough money to do the things that you want to do, over-investing in the actual rights fee and not leaving enough money to do the hard work of making it impactful.
So one question we have pretty commonly about any event or any sponsorship is, how do you prove return on investment for a sponsorship either with an athlete or with a brand at an event like the Olympics?
It's going to vary by company, right? So the most important thing for evaluation is to get everybody in agreement well before the games have begun on what success looks like, right? So from a PR standpoint, again, back in the beginning of this, when we all started this, however long ago it was, it might be measured by the size of the clip book, right? But today, depending on the program that you have, it might be measured on, how many shares did your video have? What was how did people feel about the company before the games, and how do they feel about the company after? Do we have the research that does like sentiment research? And again, that's for a corporation. For a consumer brand, there might be propensity to buy. So there's consideration. So I think that the key thing for these sponsorships is to establish a baseline really early on in the process. So for example, McDonald's, and again, I'm guessing because we don't represent them, part of their KPIs might have been around how many of our franchisees, activated an Olympic relationship, an Olympic partnership in their respective stores, right? They can't necessarily control the sales. That's a really hard thing to do. You're not going to be able to measure, I sold 25 more Big Macs this month because of the Olympics. It could very well be that, some football team's bus broke down a block from the Olympics, and 25 people got out of the bus and walked into the McDonald's, and that's why they sold 25 more. So to do a very clear, proof around consumer lift with specific brands is very, very, very hard to do. But you can measure reputational lift. You can measure employee engagement. What did employees know about why we sponsored the games 2 years ago? Why do they know now, and do they feel it's a positive association? You can measure a lot of things on social, in terms of engagement, sentiment, and so forth. So I think, again, every company is going to have a different measurement. I think, Citi, for example, would have a very different measurement toolbox than Coca-Cola. So I think the most important thing is being really realistic and specific about what you're going to try to measure that you can really attribute to the Olympics as opposed to something else that's happening in the more macro environmental space.
So I guess just to tie it up with a conclusion, when you're planning on making your choices in investment, you want to find opportunities that are going to align with your brand. You're going to want to have eyes and ears and actual people, just like Peter was, on the ground at the event. If you're not there, you can't really get a full sense for the issue. While you're promoting your sponsorship, Al, and while you're developing your communications and marketing plans, you want to blend both traditional news and traditional PR tactics with new forms of communication. You want to go to market with a multi-channel approach. Because if you do that, one, you can measure it more easily because digital monitoring and media monitoring, PR and social monitoring, avail yourself to it. You can actually track what the issues are live in real time, just like we did while we were tracking whether Zika was an issue or how impactful Lockheed's incident was on the actual issues of crime and how it came out to be 16% of the share of voice of all of the issues at the Olympics. Peter, do you have any other kind of final conclusion points for our audience today?
Sure. I think the last point we'll leave you with is, it's a very, very competitive environment, right? There are, if you add up the global Olympic sponsors and the U.S. Olympic sponsors, you're probably looking at 50 of the world's largest companies, multinationals, investing in the Olympics. So when we look at the competition, typically I think you tend to look at the competition in your vertical space. So again, in the case of Citi, we weren't really looking at, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Chase in terms of what's the competition up to. We have to kind of look at what Procter & Gamble is up to and what AT&T is up to, because the competition is fierce for media coverage, for sentiment, for social media engagement, even the advertising, that you're doing in our case, on NBC. So from a competitive standpoint, if you go back to the research question, and you go back to the ROI question, you do have to start thinking about, the place you're competing in and looking at the competition, and it's fairly atypical, because usually when brands go to market, you're generally looking at the competition in your particular area. With the Olympics, you are competing with other big sponsors, so to the extent that you can kind of keep an eye on what they're up to, and in some cases partner with them, where it might make sense, but also try to carve out your own unique space. You have, again, these huge companies with huge budgets trying to carve out, very clear paths. So being original and unique and authentic at the same time, which is a hard ask, but because you're competing with these other companies, we think that's very, very important.
Well, I'd like to thank you very, very much for joining me today, Peter, and I'd like to thank CommPro as well for hosting both of us. We'll continue to take any of your questions. Feel free to contact Peter and I directly, and we'll try to get all of your kind of additional questions back to you as soon as we can. Peter, thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That does conclude today's webcast. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time, and have a great day.